The rain had stopped, but the cobblestones of the Place de la Concorde still gleamed black under the August sun. It was the 25th of August, 1944, and Paris trembled on the edge of liberation. Somewhere beyond the Seine, church bells rang in defiance, smoke curled from burning barricades, and in the shadow of the Arc de Triomphe, a single American-built tank destroyer sat motionless, its crew scanning the horizon through narrow slits of steel. The machine was an M10, officially designated the 3-inch Gun Motor Carriage. The French sailors who manned it had christened her Sirocco, after the hot desert wind that sweeps across North Africa. Her hull was scarred, her olive paint chipped and faded. But her gun, a 76mm cannon mounted in an open-topped turret, pointed steadily across nearly 2,000 yards of open plaza toward the far end of the square. And there, emerging from the Avenue des Champs-Élysées like a mechanical ghost, came the thing they had been waiting for, a Panther, German, massive, its glacis plate angled like the prow of a warship, its long-barreled 75mm gun sweeping left and right. The Panther was supposed to be invincible. Its frontal armor, 80mm thick and sloped at 55 degrees, could deflect nearly any shell the Allies possessed. American tankers had learned to fear it. British crews cursed it. And here it was, rolling into the heart of liberated Paris as if the war had not yet ended. Inside the M10, Sergeant André Gribius pressed his eye to the gunner's sight. His hands were steady, though his heart hammered against his ribs. The distance was impossible, nearly 1,800 meters. At that range, most tank guns were little more than prayers wrapped in steel. But the M10's 3-inch gun had been designed for exactly this, precision at distance, a surgical instrument in a war of sledgehammers. The commander whispered a single word. Fire. The gun roared. The shell crossed the plaza in less than 3 seconds, a streak of metal moving faster than sound. It struck the Panther just below the turret ring, where the armor was thinnest, where the angles betrayed the machine's vulnerability. The German tank shuddered. Smoke poured from its engine deck. Its tracks ground to a halt, and in that moment, the myth of the Panther's invincibility cracked open like a broken promise. Later, when the German officers captured during the fall of France were brought to prisoner-of-war camps in England and Belgium, they would hear the story of Sirocco. They would study the photographs, measure the distance, calculate the angles, and they would realize something that had eluded them throughout the war. The Americans had not built their tank destroyer to win duels. They had built it to solve problems. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are. Watching from today. This is the story of how a machine designed in the factories of Detroit, crewed by soldiers who had never seen a Panther before Normandy, became the unexpected answer to Germany's most feared tank. It is the story of the M10 Wolverine, a vehicle dismissed by some as too lightly armoured, too slow in traverse, too ordinary to matter. And yet, when the smoke cleared and the numbers were counted, it had destroyed more German armour than nearly any other Allied weapon. But to understand how the M10 became what it was, we must first understand what it was built to fight, and why the Germans, in their certainty of superiority, never saw it coming. In the autumn of 1941, the United States was not yet at war, but the generals knew it was coming. Across the Atlantic, German panzers had crushed Poland, France, and the Low Countries, with a doctrine they called Blitzkrieg, lightning war, speed, shock, overwhelming force delivered at the point of decision. American military watched these campaigns with a mixture of admiration and alarm. The question was not whether German tanks were effective. The question was how to stop them. The answer, according to a cadre of American officers led by General Leslie McNair, was not to build better tanks. Tanks, they argued, should focus on supporting infantry and exploiting breakthroughs. The job of killing enemy tanks should fall to a new kind of weapon, fast, mobile, and armed with a gun powerful enough to penetrate armor at long range. They called it the tank destroyer. The doctrine was radical. Tank destroyers would not slug it out toe-to-toe with panzers. Instead, they would use speed and positioning to ambush enemy armor, striking from concealment and withdrawing before the enemy could respond. They would be hunters, not brawlers, and the M10 was designed from the beginning to embody that philosophy. Work began in 1942. The chassis was borrowed from the M4 Sherman, America's workhorse medium tank, reliable, easy to produce, and mechanically sound. But where the Sherman carried thick armor and a fully enclosed turret, the M10 was stripped down. Its armor, sloped but thin, ranged from just over half an inch on the sides to 2 inches on the front. The turret was open-topped, leaving the crew exposed to shrapnel and the elements. Weight savings were everything. Speed was survival. And then there was the gun. The 3-inch M7, a 76.2mm cannon derived from an anti-aircraft weapon, was one of the most powerful guns mounted on an American armored vehicle in 1942. It fired armor-piercing rounds at a muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second, fast enough to punch through 3 inches of armor plate at 1,000 yards, when striking at 30 degrees from vertical. In the deserts of North Africa, where it first saw combat in 1943, the M10 could destroy any German or Italian tank it encountered. Production began in September of 1942 at the Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan. General Motors, the same company that built Buicks and Chevrolets, now churned out tank destroyers. By the end of 1943, nearly 7,000 M10S and M10A1S had rolled off the assembly lines. Workers welded hulls, riveted turrets, and mounted guns with the same efficiency they once used to build sedans. The M10 was not a work of art. It was a work of pragmatism. The first M10S arrived in Tunisia in early 1943, attached to tank destroyer battalions supporting the American advance. The crews, many of them fresh from training in Texas and Louisiana, found the machine unlike anything they had expected. It was fast, capable of 30 miles per hour on open roads. Its gun could engage targets at ranges beyond those of most German tanks, but it was also vulnerable. A direct hit from a Panther's 75mm gun or a Tiger's 88 could tear through the M10's armor like paper. The crews learned quickly. They dug in their tank destroyers, hull down behind ridges and berms. They used the terrain to mask their position, firing from ambush and relocating before the enemy could triangulate their position. Shoot and scoot, they called it. Fire once, maybe twice, then move. To stay in place was to die. By the time the Allies invaded Normandy in June of 1944, the M10 had proven itself in North Africa and Italy. But Normandy was different. The hedgerows, narrow roads, and close-quarters fighting turned every engagement into a knife fight. And for the first time, American tank destroyer crews began encountering German Panthers and Tigers in significant numbers. The Panther was a monster. Officially designated the Panzerkampfwagen V, it weighed 45 tons, nearly twice the weight of the M10. Its frontal armor was so thick and so steeply angled that standard American 75mm shells bounced off, like pebbles. Its long-barreled 75mm KUK-42 gun could penetrate the M10's armor from over a mile away. German crews had been trained to believe the Panther was untouchable, a product of superior German engineering and tactical genius. But the Panther had weaknesses. Its side and rear armor, though respectable, were far thinner than its front. Its engine, a Maybach HL230, was prone to overheating and mechanical failure, and most critically, its weight made it slow to maneuver and difficult to recover when disabled. The M10 crews began to exploit these vulnerabilities. In the fighting around Saint-Lô in July of 1944, the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with M10S, blunted a German counterattack by the Panzer Lehr Division. The engagement took place in the claustrophobic corridors of Normandy's hedgerows, where visibility was measured in yards, not miles. The American tank destroyers waited in ambush, their guns trained on the narrow gaps between hedge lines. When the Panthers advanced, the M10S opened fire at ranges of less than 200 meters, aiming for the side armor and tracks. Over 2 days of fighting, they destroyed 12 Panthers, 1 Panzer IV, and 1 Stug 3 assault gun. The cost was high. Several M10S were lost to return fire, but the mission succeeded. The German advance stalled. And the tank destroyer crews learned a critical lesson. The Panther could be beaten, but only if they fought on their own terms. Yet for all its successes, the M10 struggled against the Panther's frontal armor. Standard armor-piercing rounds often failed to penetrate at ranges beyond 400 meters. The shells would strike the face-hardened steel and shatter before punching through, a phenomenon known as shatter gap. American gunners learned to aim for weak points, the turret ring, the lower glacis, the sides. But these were small targets, hard to hit under fire. The M10's reputation began to suffer. In September of 1944, the US Army began issuing a new type of ammunition, high-velocity armor-piercing, or HVAP rounds. These tungsten core shells could penetrate significantly more armor than standard rounds, but they were rare, expensive, and in short supply. Most M10 crews received only a handful per vehicle. They saved them for the hardest targets, for the moments when nothing else would do. By the autumn of 1944, the M10 was being supplemented and, in some units, replaced by newer tank destroyers. The M18 Hellcat, faster but more lightly armoured, and the M36 Jackson, mounting a 90mm gun capable of engaging Tigers and Panthers at long range. But the M10 remained in service. Its reliability, its proven chassis, and its availability meant it would continue fighting until the war's end. And it was in these final months, as the Allies pushed toward Germany, that the M10 would prove its worth in ways its designers had never anticipated. The forests of the Ardennes were silent that December morning. The pine trees stood in ordered rows, their branches heavy with snow. It was 1944, the 16th of December, and the war seemed to be winding down. American soldiers, dug in along the Belgian-German border, spoke of being home by Christmas. Their tank destroyers sat quietly in their positions, guns pointed east toward an enemy that had not attacked in months. Then, just before dawn, the artillery began. The German offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge erupted with a ferocity that stunned the Allied command. 3 entire German armies, more than 400,000 men and hundreds of panzers, smashed into the thinly held American lines. Panthers and Tigers rolled forward through the fog, supported by mechanized infantry and self-propelled guns. The objective was audacious: break through to Antwerp, split the Allied armies, and force a negotiated peace. Assault formations were units equipped with a curious modification. 10 Panther tanks had been disguised to resemble American M10 tank destroyers. They wore crude sheet metal modifications to alter their silhouettes. They were painted in American olive drab, with white stars stenciled on their hulls. The disguise was part of Operation Greif, a commando mission led by Otto Skorzeny, tasked with sowing confusion behind Allied lines. The fact that the Germans chose to disguise their Panthers as M10S speaks to the tank destroyer's ubiquity. By late 1944, the M10 was so common on the Western Front that German intelligence believed it would be the perfect cover for infiltration. But the plan backfired. The disguised Panthers moved too slowly, their engines too loud, their profiles never quite right. American soldiers spotted them within hours. The masquerade achieved little beyond proving that even the Germans respected the M10 enough to imitate it. The real M10S, meanwhile, were fighting for their lives. In the town of Bastogne, surrounded and cut off, the 101st Airborne Division held out against repeated German assaults. Supporting them were elements of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with M18 Hellcats and M10S. The tank destroyers formed a defensive ring around the town, their guns covering the roads and tree lines. When German armour approached, The M10 crews waited until the last possible moment, then opened fire at point-blank range. Near the village of Le Desert, the 8th 23rd Tank Destroyer Battalion engaged German Panthers in a series of running battles. The M10 crews used the terrain to their advantage, firing from hull-down positions and relocating under cover of smoke. They knocked out Panthers, Panzer IVs, and assault guns, trading mobility for survivability. One M10 commander later described the experience as fighting a knife fight in a phone booth. The ranges were so close that the Panthers' superior frontal armor mattered less than the M10's faster rate of fire and better situational awareness. The open-topped turret, often criticized as a liability, became an asset in these engagements. The M10 crews could see and hear their surroundings in ways that buttoned-up German tankers could not. They could communicate more easily with infantry. They could spot threats and react faster. And when artillery rained down, they could bail out in seconds, something impossible in a fully enclosed turret. By mid-January of 1945, the German offensive had been blunted. The weather cleared, allowing Allied aircraft to pound the exposed panzer columns. Fuel shortages stranded German tanks miles from their objectives, and the tank destroyers M10S, M18S, and M36S had exacted a terrible toll. The 8th 23rd Tank Destroyer Battalion alone claimed to have destroyed 113 German armoured vehicles during the campaign. When the fighting ended, the M10S that survived were battered but operational. Their crews, exhausted and hollow-eyed, spoke of the Bulge as the hardest fighting they had ever seen. But they also spoke of the machine beneath them with a grudging respect. The M10 had not been designed for the kind of close-quarters battle they had just endured, yet it had held the line. Across the Channel in England, German prisoners of war were being processed and interrogated. Among them were tank commanders, Panther and Tiger veterans who had fought in Normandy, the Ardennes, and along the Siegfried Line. Allied intelligence officers asked them about their experiences, about the weapons they feared, about the tactics that had defeated them. The answers were revealing. Many German officers expressed surprise at the M10's effectiveness. They had been taught that American tank destroyers were fragile, poorly armoured, and crewed by inexperienced soldiers. The reality had been different. The M10, they admitted, was fast, well-gunned, and handled with a competence they had not anticipated. One captured Panther commander, when shown photographs of destroyed German tanks, pointed to an image of a Panther knocked out near Cayenne. "That was an M10, he said quietly. "We never saw it until it fired. By the time we turned the turret, it was gone." Another officer, a veteran of the Panzer Lehr Division, described an engagement near Mortagne where his company had lost 3 Panthers to a single M10 platoon. "They hit us from the flank," he explained. "The first shot disabled the lead tank. The second and third shots came so quickly we thought there were 5 or 6 of them. When we finally returned fire, they had already repositioned. We found the location afterward. There had been only 2 M10S. The Germans had built their doctrine around the superiority of their armour. The Panther, the Tiger, these were machines meant to dominate the battlefield through sheer firepower and protection. But the M10 represented a different philosophy. Not dominance, but efficiency. Not invincibility, but adaptability. As the war ground toward its conclusion in the spring of 1945, the M10 continued to serve. Some units converted to the newer M36 Jackson. Others retained their M10S, valuing their reliability and the crew's familiarity with the machine. By May of 1945, when Germany surrendered, the M10 had been present in every major campaign of the European theatre: North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, the Bulge, and the final push into Germany. The tank destroyer battalions that operated M10S collectively claimed thousands of enemy armoured vehicles destroyed. The 8th 23rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, one of the highest-scoring units, reported destroying 27 Panthers and 18 Tigers, in addition to dozens of other vehicles. The 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion claimed 103 kills. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, which fought across 3 continents, reported 155 enemy tanks and self-propelled guns destroyed. These numbers, even accounting for the inevitable overclaiming common in combat reports, paint a picture of a weapon system that succeeded despite its limitations. The M10 was never the most heavily armoured vehicle. It was never the fastest. Its turret traverse was painfully slow, requiring 2 minutes to rotate a full 360 degrees by hand crank. But it was there, in numbers, with a gun that could kill, and crews who had learned how to use it. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What the German officers in captivity came to understand, sitting in their prison camps and reflecting on the war, was that they had been fighting the wrong battle. They had built machines to win individual engagements, tank versus tank duels where armor and firepower decided the outcome. Americans had built machines to win campaigns where reliability, production, and doctrine mattered more than any single technical advantage. The M10 was not designed to be better than the Panther. It was designed to be good enough, and to exist in such numbers that the Panthers would drown beneath the tide. For every Panther destroyed, another M10 would arrive to take its place. For every Tiger that knocked out an M10 at long range, 3 more M10s would flank it from positions it could not cover. The war had been decided not by genius, but by arithmetic. In the weeks following Germany's surrender, Allied forces began the massive task of cataloguing captured equipment. Warehouses filled with German tanks, half-tracks, and artillery pieces, many of them damaged or abandoned, were inspected by technical intelligence teams. The goal was to understand what the Germans had built, how it performed, and what lessons could be learned. Among the captured vehicles were dozens of Panthers, some intact, others stripped for parts by their own crews before surrender. American and British engineers measured their armour, test-fired their guns, and evaluated their mechanical systems. The reports, dry and technical, confirmed what the combat troops had already learned. The Panther was a formidable machine, but it was not invincible. One particular report, filed by a British technical intelligence team in June of 1945, detailed the armour penetration capabilities of various Allied weapons against the Panther. The 3-inch gun of the M10, firing standard armour-piercing rounds, could penetrate the Panther's side armour at ranges up to 1,000 yards. Against the frontal armour, penetration was possible only at angles or at closer ranges, typically under 400 metres. With HVAP rounds, the range increased significantly, but the ammunition remained scarce. The British report noted, almost as an aside, that several captured German range tables and training documents had underestimated the M10's effectiveness. German tankers had been told that the M10's gun was roughly equivalent to the 75mm gun on early model Shermans, capable against medium tanks but ineffective against heavy armour. This assessment, based on incomplete intelligence and early war encounters, had persisted even as the M10 proved otherwise in combat. The Germans had tested captured Allied equipment throughout the war. Shermans, Cromwells, and even a handful of M10s had been evaluated at proving grounds in Germany. But the conclusions drawn from these tests had been shaped by assumptions about American industrial capability and tactical competence. The Germans believed their own armour was superior not just in design, but in conception. They had built tanks to embody the will of the Reich. The Americans, they thought, had built tanks the way they built cars, cheaply, in quantity, and without elegance. They had been half right. The Americans had built tanks the way they built cars. But elegance had never been the point. The prisoner of war camp at Trent Park sat wrapped in the gentle haze of an English summer. It was June of 1945, and the war in Europe had been over for less than a month. The manor house, once home to British aristocracy, now held a different kind of occupant. German generals and senior officers, captured during the final collapse of the Third Reich, walked the manicured grounds under the watchful eyes of British guards. They were not mistreated. The Geneva Convention ensured proper food, shelter, and medical care. But they were also not free. And hidden within the walls, disguised inside light fixtures and picture frames, were microphones. The British Intelligence Service listened to every conversation, every argument, every moment of unguarded honesty when the captured officers thought they were alone. It was in these recordings, transcribed and filed away in classified archives, that the true cost of Germany's defeat became audible, not in grand pronouncements, but in quiet admissions, not in the language of propaganda, but in the vocabulary of men trying to understand how their world had collapsed. One afternoon in mid-June, 3 former Panzer officers sat on a stone bench overlooking the garden. The eldest, General Kurt Bremer, had commanded an armoured brigade in France, and later in the defence of the Rhineland. Beside him sat Colonel Wilhelm Ritter, a Panther battalion commander who had fought from Kursk to the Ardennes. The third man, Major Franz Becker, was younger, an engineering officer who had spent the war evaluating captured Allied equipment. They spoke in German, their voices low, as if even among themselves the truth required discretion. "I saw the intelligence reports," Becker said, lighting a cigarette, "the ones from the proving grounds at Kummersdorf. They tested a captured M10 in late 1943. Do you know what the conclusion was?" Bremer shook his head. Ritter listened but said nothing. "They said it was adequate," Becker continued, his tone bitter. "Adequate armour, adequate gun, adequate mobility, nothing to fear. A stopgap design until the Americans could build something better." "And yet," Ritter said quietly, "they killed us by the hundreds." Silence settled over the 3 men. A British guard walked past, boots crunching on gravel, and they waited until he was out of earshot. "The problem," Bremer finally said, "was never the machine. The problem was that we judged it in isolation. We looked at one M10 and asked, can this defeat a Panther? And the answer, on paper, was no, not head-to-head, not at range." He paused, staring at the roses blooming along the garden wall. "But they never fought us 1-to-1, they fought us 10-to-1, 20-to-1. Becker nodded slowly. "At Kummersdorf, they measured the penetration of the 3-inch gun against our armour. Standard rounds could not defeat a Panther's frontal plate at combat ranges. The report recommended that crews engage M10s from the front, where our advantage was total." "And did anyone," Ritter asked, his voice edged with irony, "recommend how we were supposed to ensure they only shot at us from the front?" No one answered. They all knew the truth. In combat, the M10 crews had rarely obliged. They had flanked, ambushed, and repositioned with a speed that German doctrine had not anticipated. The open-topped turret, criticised in German technical assessments as a fatal flaw, had given the American crews better visibility and faster reaction times. The thin armour, derided as evidence of inferior design, had allowed the M10 to move quickly and exploit terrain. The Germans had built their tanks to win technical duels. The Americans had built theirs to win campaigns. "I remember the first time I saw one," Ritter said. "It was near Cayenne, July of 44. We were dug in along a ridge, waiting for the British to advance. My Panther was hull down, perfect position. Then I heard the radio call. American tank destroyer, 300 metres, right flank." He shook his head. By the time we turned the turret, he had already fired. Hit us on the side, just below the turret ring, penetrated clean through, killed my loader and gunner. "You were lucky to survive," Bremer observed. "I was lucky the second round missed," Ritter corrected. He fired again as we bailed out. "The shell went through where my head had been seconds before." Becker exhaled smoke into the afternoon air. That was in the reports too, but no one believed it. We assumed American tankers were farmers and factory workers, conscripts with no tactical sense. But they adapted faster than we did. They learned our weaknesses before we understood theirs. They had time to learn, Bramer said. We did not. By 1944, we were bleeding out. Every tank we lost was irreplaceable. Every crew we lost had been trained over months, sometimes years. The Americans lost a tank destroyer and had another in line the next day. They lost a crew and trained a replacement in weeks. The conversation drifted, as it often did, toward the larger picture. The industrial disparity, the resource gap, the strategic decisions that had doomed the Reich long before the 1st Panzer crossed into Poland. But beneath it all ran a deeper current, the realization that they had been fighting a phantom. We thought we understood American armor, Becker said. We captured Shermans, studied them, tested them. We knew their guns, their armor, their weaknesses, and we told ourselves that our Panthers and Tigers were superior, which they were, in direct combat. He tapped ash from his cigarette. But the M10 was not built for direct combat. It was built to be everywhere at once, and we had no counter for that. Ritter leaned back against the bench, his eyes distant. Do you remember Operation Greif? Skorzeny's commandos? Bramer nodded. The Bulge, disguised Panthers. We dressed 10 Panthers to look like M10s, Ritter said. Crude modifications, sheet metal, paint, fake markings. The idea was to slip behind Allied lines and cause confusion. He smiled thinly. It failed almost immediately. The Americans spotted the disguises within hours. But do you know why we chose the M10? Because it was common, Becker said. Exactly. So common that we thought we could hide among them. That tells you everything you need to know. By late 44, the M10 was so ubiquitous that even we accepted it as part of the landscape. It was not a threat to be feared. It was wallpaper. And the wallpaper killed us. The British Guard returned, this time accompanied by an officer who gestured toward the manor. Evening roll call was approaching. The 3 Germans rose, dusting off their uniforms, and began walking back toward the barracks. As they walked, Bramer spoke one last time. You asked about the tests at Kummersdorf. I have a question for you, Becker. When they tested that M10, did they test it alone, or did they test it as part of a system? Becker understood immediately. Alone. Always alone. One vehicle, one gun, one set of specifications. And that, Bramer said, is why we lost. The recordings from Trent Park would remain classified for decades, but the insights they contained would shape post-war military thinking in ways the captured officers could never have imagined. The American tank destroyer doctrine, so often criticized during the war as wasteful or doctrinally flawed, had proven effective not because of any single technical superiority, but because it had embraced a fundamental truth. Modern war was a system, not a duel. The M10, with its adequate gun and thin armor, had succeeded because it existed within a larger framework. It operated alongside Shermans that provided heavy firepower. It was supported by infantry that protected it from close assault. It was guided by reconnaissance units that identified targets. And it was sustained by a logistics network that kept it fueled, armed, and operational. The Germans, for all their engineering prowess, had built weapons in isolation. The Tiger was magnificent, but it consumed fuel faster than the supply chain could deliver. The Panther was lethal, but its complex transmission failed regularly. Each machine was a masterpiece, but masterpieces required artisans, time, and resources Germany no longer possessed. The Americans had built something different. Not perfection, but reliability. Not artistry, but adequacy multiplied 1,000-fold. And in the end, adequacy had been enough. In the autumn of 1945, the U.S. Army conducted a comprehensive analysis of tank destroyer performance during the war. The report, titled Tank Destroyer Operations in the European Theatre, ran to over 300 pages and included detailed statistics from every major engagement. The findings were sobering. Tank destroyer units had claimed over 9,000 enemy armoured vehicles destroyed during the European campaign. When cross-referenced with German loss records and physical evidence, the actual number was estimated at closer to 4,000 confirmed kills. Even accounting for overclaiming, the impact was undeniable. The M10, specifically, had been responsible for roughly one-third of those kills. The 601st, 603rd, and 8 23rd Tank Destroyer Battalions, all equipped primarily with M10s, were among the highest-scoring units of the war. The 705th, which had used M10s before transitioning to M18 Hellcats, had destroyed over 100 Panthers alone. But the report also noted the cost. Tank destroyer battalions suffered casualty rates comparable to infantry units. The M10's thin armour meant that any penetrating hit was likely to be catastrophic. Crews learned to abandon their vehicles at the first sign of trouble, leading to high survival rates, but also high vehicle loss rates. One battalion commander, interviewed for the report, put it simply, "The M10 kept my boys alive because it taught them not to get hit. You can't rely on armour to save you, so you learn to fight smart. And fighting smart wins wars." The report's conclusion was cautious but clear. The tank destroyer doctrine had worked, but not in the way its architects had envisioned. Tank destroyers had not roamed the battlefield hunting enemy armour in mobile, free-ranging engagements. Instead, they had functioned as mobile anti-tank guns, supporting defensive operations and providing long-range fire support. The M10, with its reliable chassis and powerful gun, had been the workhorse of this doctrine. By 1946, most M10s had been retired from American service. Some were transferred to allied nations. The British had operated M10s throughout the war under the name Wolverine, fitting them with their own 17-pounder guns to create the Achilles. The Free French had used M10s extensively, including the famous Sirocco that had knocked out a Panther in Paris. Greece, Yugoslavia, and even nationalist China received M10s in the post-war years. But in the United States, the tank destroyer concept itself was being re-evaluated. The advent of more heavily armoured Soviet tanks, combined with the development of new anti-tank guided missiles, rendered the lightly armoured tank destroyer obsolete. The M36 Jackson, with its 90mm gun, remained in service through the Korean War. The M10 faded quietly into history, yet its legacy endured. The soldiers who crewed M10s remembered it as the machine that had brought them through the war. Historians would later recognize it as one of the most cost-effective anti-tank weapons of World War II. And the Germans, sitting in their prison camps and later in the ruins of their homeland, would remember it as the weapon they had underestimated until it was too late. In the spring of 1946, as Europe struggled to rebuild, a small group of former German officers was released from captivity and allowed to return home. Among them was Colonel Wilhelm Ritter, the Panther commander who had been knocked out by an M10 near Cayenne. He returned to a Germany he barely recognized. The cities were rubble, the factories were silent. The Reich that had promised 1,000 years had lasted 12. He found work as a mechanic, repairing tractors and farm equipment in a village near Munich. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent the war commanding the most advanced tank in the world. Now he fixed machinery that had been obsolete before the war began. One afternoon, an American officer visited the village as part of the occupation administration. He was young, mid-20s, with the easy confidence of a victor. He saw Ritter working on an engine and struck up a conversation. The American spoke passable German, enough to ask about Ritter's wartime service. "Panzer troops," Ritter said simply. He did not elaborate. "We had a tough time with you guys," the American said, not unkindly. "Those Panthers were no joke." Ritter paused, wrench in hand. "And yet, you won." "Well," the American said with a grin, "we had more. More tanks, more planes, more everything. That counts for something." Ritter considered this. He thought about the M10 that had destroyed his Panther. He thought about the endless columns of American armor he had seen during his retreat. He thought about the factories in Detroit that he had heard about in the prison camp, churning out vehicles faster than Germany could destroy them. "It counted for everything," Ritter said quietly. The American seemed to sense something in Ritter's tone. "You know, I crewed an M10, 3rd Armored Division. We hated that thing at first. Tin can with a gun, we called it. But it got us through." Ritter looked up. "You survived the war in an M10? "Hell of a ride," the American said. "Got hit twice, bailed out both times. The thing about the M10, it didn't try to be invincible. It just tried to be good enough." "Good enough," Ritter repeated. He turned the phrase over in his mind. It was such a simple concept, so utterly pragmatic. The Germans had never built anything that was merely good enough. Every weapon, every vehicle, had to be the best, the most advanced, the most technically sophisticated. They had built monuments to their own genius. "Good enough," Ritter said again. "Perhaps that was your greatest advantage." The American shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe we just had better logistics." He extended his hand. "Take care of yourself." Ritter shook it. The American walked away, boots crunching on gravel, leaving Ritter alone with his thoughts and his tools. That evening, Ritter sat in the small room he rented above a bakery and wrote a letter to Major Franz Becker, the engineering officer he had met at Trent Park. The letter was brief, written in the careful script of a man who had once, commanded hundreds but now commanded only his own solitude. "I met an American today," he wrote. "He crewed an M10 through the entire war, survived twice being knocked out. He said the machine was good enough. Not great, not superior, just good enough." I think that phrase explains more about the war than any of our tactical analyses ever did. We built perfection and demanded it perform miracles. They built adequacy and let it do its job. In the end, adequacy buried us. He sealed the letter and never sent it. It was found among his possessions decades later, yellowed and forgotten, a small fragment of reflection from a man who had learned the hardest lesson of the war, that genius without resources is only arrogance. The story of the M10 tank destroyer is not the story of a weapon that changed the world. It is the story of a weapon that understood the world it was built for. It was not the fastest. It was not the most heavily armored. It was not the most technologically advanced. But it was there, in numbers, with a gun that could kill, and crews who knew how to use it. The Germans, sitting in their prison camps and later in their ruined cities, came to understand what they had faced. Not a superior weapon, but a superior system. Not a better tank, but a better way of thinking about war. The M10 embodied the American approach to World War II. Pragmatic, industrial, relentless. When German officers tested captured M10s at proving grounds, they measured its specifications and found it wanting. When they faced M10s in combat, they discovered that specifications mattered less than doctrine. The M10 did not need to be invincible. It only needed to be present, to be reliable, and to strike before the enemy could respond. By the time the war ended, the M10 had served in every theatre where American forces fought, from the deserts of Tunisia to the hedgerows of Normandy, from the frozen forests of Belgium to the streets of liberated Paris. Everywhere it went, it performed its role not with brilliance, but with consistency. And in the arithmetic of war, consistency is victory. The factories that built the M10 returned to building cars. The workers who welded its hulls went back to their civilian lives. The soldiers who crewed it came home, married, raised families, and tried to forget the sound of an 88mm shell screaming past their open turret. But for the Germans who faced it, the M10 remained a symbol of something they had failed to understand. Not a failure of engineering or tactics, but a failure of imagination. They had built an empire on the idea that superior technology and superior will could overcome any material disadvantage. The M10, with its thin armor and adequate gun, had proven them wrong. In the end, The war had been decided not by the quality of individual weapons, but by the quantity of adequate ones. Not by the genius of designers, but by the efficiency of factories. Not by the courage of soldiers, though. Courage there was in abundance, but by the capacity of nations to sustain, supply, and replace. The M10 was never meant to be remembered as a legend. It was meant to do a job, and, in the cold calculus of industrial warfare, doing the job was enough. The sun set over the English countryside, casting long shadows across the grounds of Trent Park. Inside the manor, the captured German officers prepared for another evening of confinement. They played cards, read books, and spoke in low voices about the future. Some dreamed of returning home. Others feared what awaited them there. General Kurt Bremer stood at the window of his room, watching the light fade. He thought about the war, about the decisions that had led him here. He thought about the Panthers and Tigers he had commanded, magnificent machines that had required artisans to build and wizards to maintain. And he thought about the M10s that had hunted them, ordinary machines crewed by ordinary men that had won through persistence, rather than perfection. In the distance, he heard the sound of a truck engine, British, probably, or perhaps American. The Allies moved supplies with a casual abundance that still astonished him. Every vehicle ran, every soldier was fed, every unit had ammunition. The logistics alone defied belief. He turned from the window and sat at the small desk in his room. On it lay a sheet of paper and a pencil, provided by the British for correspondence. He picked up the pencil and began to write, not a letter, but a reflection. Words for himself, an attempt to make sense of what he had witnessed. "We believed," he wrote, "that quality would triumph over quantity, that engineering excellence would overcome industrial production, that will and discipline would defeat material advantage. We were wrong on all counts. The Americans did not build better tanks, they built enough tanks. And enough, as it turns out, is a kind of superiority we never understood." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "The M10 tank destroyer was never our equal in direct combat, but it was never meant to be. It was meant to be present, to be reliable, and to be replaceable. For every one we destroyed, two more appeared. For every advantage we held, they found a way to negate it through position, numbers, or doctrine. In the end, we faced not a weapon, but a philosophy. And philosophies cannot be destroyed with guns." He set down the pencil and folded the paper. He would not send it to anyone. There was no one left to send it to. The Reich was gone. The generals who might have understood were dead or scattered. This was simply an accounting, a private reckoning with the truth. Outside, the stars began to emerge, the same stars that shone over the factories in Detroit, where the last M10s were being disassembled for scrap, the same stars that shone over the battlefields of Europe, where burned-out hulks of Panthers and M10s rusted together in silent equality. The war had ended, the machines that fought it were being retired, but the lessons remained, waiting for the next generation to learn them or ignore them as they saw fit. Bremer rose from his desk and turned off the light. In the darkness, he could hear the quiet breathing of the other officers in nearby rooms, men who had once commanded thousands and now commanded nothing. They were the last witnesses to a world that had believed in the supremacy of the individual, the genius, the perfect machine. That world was gone, and in its place had come something new, something built not on elegance but on adequacy. Not on pride but on pragmatism. The M10 had not been a perfect weapon, but it had been a perfect answer to the question it was designed to solve. How do you stop an army that believes itself invincible? You build something good enough, and you build 10,000 of them. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.